colleague said. Although I agree with Bill Marsh that sometimes the prosecutor is not the appropriate person to maybe be as conflict-free as they should be in reviewing a situation, I think the prosecutor usually makes the right call on the occasions where they need to either appoint a special prosecutor if those situations exist, or in Marion County, for instance, if there is a police cause fatality, it goes to the Marion County grand jury. And so therefore you are going to have an independent body of citizens determining whether or not the line was crossed.
Let me follow up on that, because we've had a couple of, one case within the last year and a half where there was, and this was under the previous prosecutor, where there was a police action, deadly shooting. It went to grand jury. It took forever and a day to go to grand jury and decide it. I don't want to rush anything to go to grand jury. It needs to be, but does there need to be maybe the process not take a whole year? Because to me, that's not fair to an officer, that they're left hanging in limbo, the community's left hanging in limbo. Make a decision, move on.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that in these circumstances, the community needs an answer as expeditiously as possible, and it is inappropriate that those would drag on. To just add to what John said, it is our responsibility by ordinance to present any police action shooting to the Marion County grand jury, and everyone probably understands what that means, but just to explain it, by chance you do not, a grand jury is impaneled just like a regular jury by a court. It's a group of voters who are summoned just like they would for jury duty, only for grand jury duty. They're questioned, they're selected and paneled by a judge, and then sit and hear matters such as a police action shooting. And so, from our perspective, we have actually presented one already this year since I've taken office, and I absolutely agree that it's necessary to move it as efficiently and as expeditiously as possible, and secondly, to make sure that in our role as the prosecutor, that we ensure that the matter is presented objectively and fairly to the grand jury.
Amos, I perceive the same thing you do about the difference between now and the mid-'70s. And I think there's been a change in the culture in the Marion County Metropolitan Police Department. And by culture, I mentioned it earlier, by the culture what I mean is peer pressure from other officers. How are other officers going to respond? Peer pressure, or not peer pressure, but supervisory standards by the chief on down, Director of Public Safety, the mayor. I think there's been a change in that respect. Good example, best example, horrible example of a culture in which this kind of thing was accepted is the trial going on in New Orleans right now. A police officer is charged with shooting people in the back during Katrina. Well, the whole system of law and order broke down. The culture just wasn't there. The police officers apparently had the attitude that about anything goes and we can do whatever we want. One other brief point I'd like to make, and that is, I also perceive, without having a whole lot of experience on this, that there's been a change in the response of people in the neighborhood, thanks to yourself, probably, Amos, more than anybody else, but a lot of other leaders, particularly in the black community, because a lot of the police action shootings occur in that community. And I think young people today have a different attitude about what to do when a police officer stops you, even if the police officer seems to be overly aggressive, even if you think the stop is wrong. I think people are being told, young black people, particularly young black men, are being told more than they used to be told. You need to swallow your pride. The most important thing is to come out of this alive and deal with it another day. So I think that's been a difference too.
Larry, you want to weigh in?
Well, I go back also to the 70s, and I do. When you said the 70s, I remember Elmira Street incident.
Oh,
it was one of the major police action incidents. But I have less confidence in the grand jury as a means of reviewing police action shootings. I guess some of my colleagues, not because of Mr. Curry, but because if you just look at the institution of the grand jury, it is in secret, and you don't know what happens in there. And primarily, the grand jury hears only evidence that the prosecutor wants them to hear, and there's not any other side. So they can be useful in terms of the prosecutor using it as kind of a sounding board, and almost as a test jury to see what where citizens come down and how they view this kind of case. So that can be useful, but in terms of really using it and giving the community confidence that this case is going to be scrutinized, I don't have a lot of confidence in grand juries, because we all know any prosecutor worth his salt can indict a ham sandwich in a grand jury, as the old saying goes. But I think the culture has changed. I think there's much more professionalism in the police department. So I agree there's been a change in 20, 30 years. And I think that's partly why we see less excessive use of force cases and also police action shootings.
I couldn't disagree more with my friend Larry Landis. Under the rules of professional responsibility, which governs all attorneys, there is one rule specifically addressed to prosecutors, and that rule requires that the prosecutor seek truth and justice. And I can't speak for the other 91 prosecutors in the state of Indiana, but we take it very seriously, and I could not disagree with Larry more. We would address those matters fairly and objectively.
Let me just respond by saying, I go back 30 years, so this isn't just about Terry, but we've all seen cases that have been buried in grand jury. So, you know, it's only as good as the ethics of the individual prosecutor, which also influences their charging decisions. So what I'm criticizing is not Terry, but the grand jury as an institution, you know, should be viewed with some question and suspicion, because it is not about a body that's going to inspire public confidence. When you don't know and you don't have access to the information that's presented, it's really hard to have the blind confidence in the grand jury process, because you don't get to know what happened behind those closed doors.
I know in some states, grand juries can issue reports. I think they did that a lot in Illinois. There's some other states that do that. Why don't we do that here? Is it just the legislature was asleep that day and rather wanted to pass something different than do that? Is there a way in, you know, and we'll come to another example, is that, why don't we do that here?
Well, I think we followed the predominant policy in most states, where we don't want the grand juries to really be a body that does advisory opinions or does investigations and then issues a proclamation, unless there is a charging decision made. So if there's no charge, then it's really no report.
A couple of other factors, I think, on that, Amos. One is grand juries have no resources. So if you get a grand jury convened and the foreman says, I think we should investigate X, so how are they going to do it? They don't have any resources. The resources all come from the prosecutor's office and their resources. Another factor is you don't want a grand jury indicting somebody that the prosecutor is not going to prosecute or not going to want to prosecute. But one final point I wanted to make quickly, and that is another reason to be skeptical about the role of the grand jury is prosecutors can easily use a grand jury as political cover. If there's a high-profile police action shooting, it might be taken to the prosecutor's office. Prosecutor's response might be, well, I took it to the grand jury, and the grand jury declined to indict. Well, as public people who don't know what goes on inside the grand jury, we have no way of knowing whether the prosecutor is seeking truth and justice, as Terry says, and I don't doubt that they do that, but I'm satisfied there are cases in which the prosecutor uses it as political cover.
Yeah, let me chime in on that. I think it's a mistake if we try to search too much for one perfect answer or one perfect process that is going to be the end-all and be-all and final say on everything that happens, and everyone's going to rally around that decision and stick to it. There are multiple layers of review in place for all these kind of police situations, starting with the internal affairs process, then the Citizens Complaint Review Board process. There is, as Professor Marsh talked about, criminal review both on the state level, the grand jury level, and many times federal Justice Department authorities look at the situation as well. And then there's the entire federal civil rights action, which is usually going to lead to some kind of a jury determination in federal court as well. So although that leads to sometimes inconsistent results and differing outcomes depending on which body you're in front of, many times that speaks to how close the facts were in the case, and how there isn't always a perfect, black and white decision in a case. There are many gray areas, but sometimes the public, I think, has to sit back, take all the information in, not be so apt to rush to judgment, but to sit back a little bit and let these layers of review take place, and then try to make an informed decision and a reasonable decision based on those different outcomes that you get from all of those layers of review.
Knowing this crowd,
Can I-
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to clarify just one thing about the grand jury, just so everyone here understands that, you know, the suggestion that the grand jury is some rogue runaway organization, I take exception to. And the reality is that in the state of Indiana, in order to charge a crime, felony or misdemeanor, that can be done by what's called an information, which is actually just initiated by a probable cause affidavit by the investigating officer. It's reviewed by a judge. The judge determines that yes, there is in fact probable cause that this person's committed that crime, and issues a warrant. So, and I don't know specifically a number, but my sense would be that 99% of the crimes that are charged in Marion County are charged outright by information, which has been reviewed by a judge, who then determines that there is probable cause to issue the warrant for that person. It is very, very rare in the federal system, with very, very few exceptions, all crimes are charged by way of a grand jury investigation. In the state of Indiana, it's entirely different, and as a consequence, the use of a grand jury is very, very limited in Marion County. As I said, by ordinance, any police action shooting has to go before the grand jury. Otherwise, matters only go before the grand jury if there's some particular reason why it makes sense to do that. One example would be if you're conducting an investigation and there's someone involved in that case that you wish to grant immunity to in order to obtain their testimony, that's one thing you can do before the grand jury that you couldn't otherwise do generally in an outright investigation. And so I just don't want anyone to go away from here thinking that the grand jury's out there investigating every single crime in the county. It is simply not the case.
I'm sure there's smarter questions out there in the audience than I have here. Who wants to venture? Don't be shy, I might give a test. There's a microphone out there to help you be heard. Oh, this is a shy crowd today.
Well, I would like for any of the panel members to just guess about this, give us your opinion. To what degree do you think changing environmental circumstances influence how police officers react out in the street? We are aware here in the city of Indianapolis and the state of Indiana, there have been some very questionable decisions made about who can carry a gun, where they can carry a gun, and we have some real questions about how those decisions came about. Now, if a police officer is out in the street, at one time, it might have been the best assumption to assume that most of the people did not have guns in their pocket. Now, the assumption is perhaps that most of the people do have guns in their pockets. To what degree does that kind of awareness perhaps influence how a police officer thinks, reacts, does things in the street?
Yeah, who wants
I
legal
think-
or illegal weapons?
Well, I think you make a wonderful point, and as Amos points out, those can be legal weapons or they can be illegal weapons. The fact is, there's clearly more weapons on the street than there used to be. That is a recognition that police officers have to have, not only out of common sense, but out of self-preservation to protect themselves and protect the beat that they're patrolling. That is a dangerous environment when there's that many guns on the street. Now, it goes back to kind of our first question of the day, which is, does the officer overreact because of that, or are they just cognizant of that from a safety perspective? I tend to believe that it's the latter, and they do a pretty good job with that. But you're right, that is an environmental factor that is reality today that we can't turn our back from.
And I think it's a testament to, going back to the question about police action shootings, that given that that's a reality, and it absolutely is, that we've had so few police action shootings, in spite of the officers' knowledge that that's the case. In fact, it's everyone's knowledge that that's the case, that it's a testament to the professionalism of virtually all of our police department. I can assure you that virtually every week, pictures cross my desk of the sort of weapons that police officers have taken off the street, and it's frightening what they're facing out there.